I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stone.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Contemplating Culture.
Hello everyone.
Now this is a bit exciting for Kat and I because we are once again in the same room. So if you're noticing jumps in sound quality, it's just because we've got different setup. But on that, I was just reflecting actually just before we press record about how neither Kat or I are very good at self-promotion. And so if you're listening to this podcast, it's quite miraculous on our account because we've probably done very little to promote it to you. But we would love you to share it with your friends if it's doing something for you, to let us know as well. I think it gives us a lot of encouragement if we know that it's doing something for you as well.
Absolutely.
So today's exciting. I don't know what it is about wrapping up a chapter, but it's just a really great feeling.
It feels like a milestone. We're getting somewhere. We're actually moving through this book.
So we are moving through. So today we get to the end of a chapter called The Impersonal Order. And we've been looking at this shift that has happened. And if you remember that image from a couple of episodes ago, it's that of the ratchet, of what happens at the end of this chapter will have reached a point that there's no going back from.
So if you remember, which I'm not guaranteeing you will because I don't necessarily from podcast to podcast, what we've been talking about is this shift that has occurred from one way of thinking and being largely in society to another. So a shift which Charles Taylor points out, from looking at the cosmos as an ordered, structured world around us to an impersonal universe that we discover through natural science. It's a shift again from seeing society as a network of personal relationships and this shift to an impersonal group of individuals who choose to come together to create society.
So that's kind of like the shift from, say, your feudal system where everyone's connected and your family chains, your village chains, to I'm a citizen, I actually have direct access now to society and I get to decide if I opt in or out.
Absolutely. And then there's a similar shift in like our view of government, politics, law, morality, a shift from things being the way things are, largely through a Judeo-Christian view of morality. This is how God set up the world. This is how we're meant to relate to one another. To, via, and we talked about this a lot of podcasts ago, via natural law, this idea we can actually come to all these things via our reason. So we can reason our way into this is what the law should be and how we should relate to one another. To now, we can actually choose. We can reason our way towards, I think this is the way, and let's agree, let's choose to make this the way we set up our society and what's right and what's wrong. So again, a shift to an impersonal order, away from this networked relational sense of things that have their meaning from originally the way that God has set up the world.
And you can see it now, like this. I always think it's good with something like this to start at the end. If you really want to understand what the impersonal order is, we're living it now. That it's all around us, and it's very much the way that we think now.
Absolutely. I think if you want to go to right to the end point, think AI. And I was listening to something recently that was suggesting that there are people in Silicon Valley who think that we would be better in the world today if instead of human beings in government, AI was ruling the world, because AI is able to be much more objective, is not swayed by emotions or relationships, so you wouldn't have the sort of corruption or even, these long drawn-out parliamentary debates that we pay people for to decide whether or not you're going to end this or bring that in. And it's all swayed by emotion. AI is beyond this emotion stuff. It's equitable, it's fair in how it sets things up. And this is where we should be going as a society. Scary, I think.
Well, What's scary is one of my favourite fantasy series growing up was kind of written in the aftertime of a nuclear apocalypse that had come about because the world had got to this point. The world had got to a point where all of the people, the governments couldn't be trusted anymore, the corruption, all of that. So they came together and they said, great, world peace will be kept by, they didn't have, I don't think they called it artificial intelligence at that point when this book was written, but a computer that would be impersonal. And at some point, the human race got out of control. And so the impersonal computer decided to set the nuclear apocalypse down because we couldn't be trusted to make the decisions ourselves. So back then it was fantasy. Now it's shifted into plausible reality.
Scary, isn't it?
And what's more is, like, you can talk about the extreme like that, but I know that it's real in me. I know that if I'm presenting something, I have to try and be as impersonal, as objective as possible, because as soon as anyone starts to see anything of me in what I'm presenting, if it's data or something like that, they'll go, whoa, 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 whoa. We can't trust. And the lack of trust we have, not just in others and into what they see as important or the decisions that they think, but even in ourselves, that we think, whoa, 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 like I need an impersonal opinion on this. You can't be too close to it. You can't have biases. You can't have emotional feelings about it. All of that's going to cloud your judgment, right? So there's this, that's what it looks like now. And it's not even that we think it's bad. Like that's what we see as the natural best course of decision making.
Absolutely. It's like it's programmed into us, because I would say there's a whole movement around, say, speakers like Brené Brown who are trying to teach us things like vulnerability and things that move in the opposite direction of this programming. But then she's having to teach it, and she's making her money out of like explaining the importance of this in human relations and even in business and government. But she's having to explain it all and teach us all, because this whole impersonal order is so natural in us that it doesn't feel right to put myself out there vulnerably before other people or share my emotional response to things.
Well, she's a great example because she was a data researcher and she had to reach this own point where she's like, wow, the data's saying this, so maybe it's true. Like, she got there by her own point. So this, I guess that's setting up where we're going. So we wanted to talk today about 3, I guess, aspects of this shift, of what really powered it through to taking hold, widespread acceptability. So the first one is this idea of what we've been talking about, this disengaged reason, which he talks about as disengagement, a movement of disengagement, that the approach that was applied to natural sciences now is applied to all of humanity, to all of how we approach things is through this very logical, distance, disengaged kind of approach.
So the idea is I have to step back from all my own biases, all the conclusions I've already jumped to, and stand outside the picture looking in order to have a reasoned and unbiased view of something. And this is seen as the good and the better way.
So we've been talking about a few episodes ago, we were talking about how ideas that start with the elite then take on widespread authority. So this is another one of them, this idea that's starting in a small sphere of the elite human scientists kind of thing, then takes on everyone should take this on. That because they're the elite, there's kind of a prestige that sits around this way of thinking. But the shift that's going to happen, it's not just a prestigious thing for a few, it's actually going to take on a superiority that can't be gone back from.
And so if you think about like the way that we think now, we just assume that the better, the superior way of coming to a conclusion, deciding what should happen, is to step back from a situation and look at it objectively and reason our way through it, and that letting my emotions or my relationship with somebody or that sort of thing bias my decision or my conclusions is like inferior. It's it's what we want to move away from. It doesn't come to the best outcomes that we can come to. And it sort of comes out of a view of history that starts to grow up around this time as well. So some quite influential, actually Scottish thinkers started looking at the world and the history of the world and mapping the stages that we've gone through as a human race, really. And they look at, well, we started in the hunter-gatherer phase, and then we grew out of that into settled agriculture. And settled agriculture was a feudal society, warriors. They settled their differences with their fists, if you like. And out of that feudal society, we've started moving towards a commercial society where we trade and we sort things out with our words. It's peaceful way of living, and reason and disengagement are part of this whole shift. And so the linking of reason and disengagement and peace, this stage of our development as a human race, means that the idea of thinking any other way, of solving our problems any other way, starts to look backwards. It's like that's how they did things in the Dark Ages. We even use that kind of language ourselves now.
Yeah.
To think about it another way, we think about, you're teaching a child how to grow and live in the world, and, little Johnny starts off by some other kid takes a toy off him and he snatches it back and hits the other kid. And Mummy says, Johnny, use your words. Mm-hmm. That it's in us, there's the sense of human growth even is a movement from settling things with my emotions and my fists to settling things with my words and reason and logic.
In such a way that when Johnny then goes to school, a whole bunch of behaviours would be relegated to before school.
Yeah, and childishness.
And so this is the same kind of thing that's happening with statism, is that a whole bunch of behaviours, ways of thinking, ways of viewing the world are grouped together and put into a previous stage. And so the point that Charles Taylor's trying to make here is that disengaged reason is part of the new stage. And actually there's a whole bunch of things to do with faith, with relationship with God, all those kinds of things that are put into a previous stage that kind of we've progressed beyond that, and it would be silly to go back. Like, why would you go back? We're now in the better stage.
Yeah, and that's all a lot associated with this idea of impersonal order. Like, it fits with this whole movement to an impersonal view of the world in natural sciences and in the way we relate to each other in society and in the way we derive our law and moral codes, etc., that we would also be shifting to a more disengaged view of how we understand faith and religion and that kind of thing. So it actually fits the whole movement towards deism that we've been talking about, fits very neatly alongside all the other moves, which makes it an easier move to sell to people, I think.
And this is one of the things that Taylor is saying, that there was a particular power that allowed this shift. It wasn't that just these things were there, but statism, all these different things took on a communal movement of power that kind of pushed this thing over the line of no return. So one of the things that kind of happens is that as we take on disengaged reason as the dominant method of looking at reality, is that it starts to shape what can then be called reality. We're no longer taking the world as we see and experience it and trying to figure out what it is. Actually, we are beginning in our minds, and we are filtering everything through our minds primarily. And what's going to happen is that some things are seen as real on account of the reasoned logic that I've decided, and some things are going to be discounted as unreal. As you were saying, there's this nice system that emerges here, and the problem with a nice system is that things don't always fit neatly into this nice system. And this he's got this quote that I love. He says, "The prestige of the stance begins to dictate what we can take in as reality."
So I was thinking, like, the best example I can think of is if I saw a pig flying past this window that we're sitting in right now. I'm a product of disengaged reason. So I immediately go, I thought I saw a pig flying past the window. My next thought is, pigs don't fly, so what really did happen?
Yeah.
In an enchanted age, back before this happened, I might have looked out the window, thought I saw a pig fly past the window, and had a completely different reaction to it. Had some kind of like, there's some kind of spiritualized pigs on the move right now, and it's telling me that something's going on in the spiritual. You know, my whole approach to it would have been to believe the evidence of my senses and then look for an explanation for it. Whereas particularly Descartes and his whole movement of coming from a space of reasoning first and distrusting our senses has taught us to look at things we see and ask the question, was that actually what I saw? What's the reasoned explanation for what I thought I saw or heard?
And this is one of the things that we're going to see we inherit now, this in our line of faith, is not only can I trust what someone saw? Can I trust what my parents saw? Can I trust can I trust every point of the chain that faith has been passed down? Or do I have to reinvent everything from right now because I can only trust my mind? I can't trust other chains of events. And so this is how different elements of faith life start to get dismantled through the lens of disengaged reason.
So Hume, another thinker around this time, puts it out there around miracles. He's like, well, if we stand back objectively and look at the scriptural accounts of miracles, what's actually more likely? That, you know, in the chain of passing down these stories that somebody have exaggerated here and somebody else got a bit enthusiastic there. And what we get now is this story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people with only 5 bread rolls. Or is it actually likely that it happened the way it said it did? And because reason tells me, well, you can't feed 5,000 people with 5 bread rolls, then I'm going to look for another explanation. And in fact, I've grown up in a world where people have looked for another explanation. And it must have been that the little boy sharing his lunch got everybody else to be generous and share their lunch too. And then there was enough food. So in such a manner, this generation of deists has started to exclude the miraculous, exclude the supernatural from their world. They're building what Charles Taylor's going to call an immanent frame.
What I find really fascinating reading through this, I think we've mentioned it before, that St. Francis de Sales is one of our patrons for the podcast, and he says in this mindset, it's really easy to discount St. Francis de Sales as well. And as I said, he's one of our patrons, so I studied in formation. I was like, but he's not like one of the had miraculous visions or, levitated. He's not one of those kind of saints. Like, why is he talking about even St. Francis de Sales get thrown out? And so we had a little discussion about, well, what was it about even St. Francis de Sales, who I would call a pretty practical, moderate, in terms of the fanatical kind of stuff. Even he's getting thrown out here.
And really what the conclusion we had to come to is St. Francis de Sales spends his life teaching people about having a personal relationship with God. And having a personal relationship with God is completely outside the system that the impersonal order has created. It doesn't fit that system because God, for the deists, creates the world and then leaves us to work the rest out. He's not interested in relating to you and me individually. And you can understand that this idea of expecting God to have a relationship with me, of talking and then God responding, sits outside of the immanent experience of these people. And therefore that's fanaticism, that's enthusiasm, that's weird. I've got to reason reason that out. It's not logical that God talks to human beings. But I just want to say that immediately came to mind when I was reading the Hume example of miracles was C.S. Lewis in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And for those who've read the story, you'll know that the story is based around a family of 4 kids, and the youngest kid, Lucy, hides in a wardrobe one day and discovers in the back of the wardrobe an opening to a whole nother world. And she's telling her siblings about it, and they don't believe her. And in the end, the oldest siblings go to talk to the professor whose house it is they're staying in, and they're telling him their concerns about Lucy and this whole new world that she's talking about, and what do we do? And his response seems to me entirely objective and reasoning, but he's coming to a completely different conclusion to the deists. He says to the older siblings, Peter and Susan, "Have you ever known Lucy to tell a lie?" And they said, "No, she's generally the most truthful child we know." And he said, "Okay, have you ever suspected that Lucy's, a little bit crazy or a little bit mad?" And they're like, "No, she's a very down-to-earth child." And he says, well, the logical conclusion you can come to then is that she's telling the truth, that there actually is another world that can be entered through the wardrobe. Fascinating, isn't it? Because he's using logic, he's using reason, he's standing back very objectively, but he's coming to a very different conclusion. And I think what that says to me is something about what you said before, or what we were talking about earlier, about once you confine yourself to a system, you have to really throw out anything that's outside the system. So that while it is possible to use disengaged reason, perhaps, to come to some idea of God and the supernatural, and in a sense we do that when we give talks. Like, I come from a world of disengaged reason, and so when I'm writing a talk about something to do with faith, I stand back and I try and, reason my way through what I'm explaining to people, because reason is the way that we expect to understand things now.
And this is actually a great point. There's another quote in here that I love that he says, disengagement may be quite the wrong way to go about increasing understanding. And he says this because what starts to happen, exactly as you've said, that people try and approach matters of faith from this stance. And he says the problem with this mode of apologetics is that it's starting from outside the reality that God is real. And so he's like, even though they're starting from this point and they're trying to, open people up to the reality of God, they're actually losing them at the first point. And this is part of, I think, what got me so passionate about even beginning this podcast was we are starting at the wrong point.
And I was even thinking, I guess if I was a deist and I was looking at the Lucy and the wardrobe example, I would start with the scenario and say, well, there aren't worlds in the back of a wardrobe, so Lucy must be lying or going a bit mad. It's no more objective or disengaged. In fact, it's actually using my experience of, I've never heard of a world that you can enter through a wardrobe. It's using my experience as the measure of what is real. Because no matter how disengaged we think we are, I don't think we can ever fully disengage.
And this is the thing, is that he's kind of saying, even though you think you're operating out of total freedom, there actually might be something imposing upon it, which brings us to our third point that I just think is really fascinating to think about, this idea of freedom. It's probably one of the biggest values in our society today. And freedom to the modern person means absolutely no limitations. Whatever is possible is possible. Whatever I can think of in my mind must be possible, that kind of idea. And then he says during this shifting point, what happens is not only that freedom starts to be valued, but dignity starts to be equated with freedom. And not only freedom, but my agency, my power to bring about that freedom, that it all kind of is linked into dignity in such a way that Orthodox Christianity is seen as being an affront to human dignity.
Well, yeah, because I think Christianity sets up human freedom, human dignity in relation to our relationship with God, that I have dignity because I'm born in relationship with God and born for relationship with God, and I have freedom because of that. My dignity comes from being created by God, intended for relationship with God. There's a whole meaning that Christianity puts around who we are as human beings that gives a story to our dignity and a reason for our freedom. But for somebody who's outside of this worldview, they look at this and go, that's a whole set of meanings that's already imposed on life and the world, which means I'm not free to make my own meaning. Therefore, I have to reject your notion of freedom. Like your Christian worldview, you're not free.
Because there's a God who has already made meaning, and he's actually an agent who is free to make meaning. So that can't be imposed upon me, and I can't be expected to be in relationship. That's like an expectation of relationship. That's another affront on my freedom.
Yeah, so all these things limit me, and I don't want to be limited. Like essentially what we want in this perspective is to be gods in our own world, to make our own choices, decide our own limits, make our own meanings. So it's interesting, Descartes is famous for bringing about, I think, the revolution in this way of thinking of disengaged reason that we've been talking about, and really defining the human person as the mind. His famous line, "I think, therefore I am," gives us a bit of a perspective on what this age thinks of human dignity and reason. That essentially we could sum up their vision of human dignity as, I think, therefore I have dignity.
Yeah. And if you study philosophy at a university level, one of the first things you're taught is take any kind of thought or ideology like this and follow it to its natural conclusions and see where it lands.
And the natural conclusions, if I think, therefore I have dignity, is that if I don't have a capacity to reason, then I'm not a valid human being. And if you look at like ethical philosophers out there these days, there are the likes of Peter Singer who would say, yeah, infanticide of a child up to the ability to reason is okay because that's our definition of a human person, is a thinking being. Or euthanasia of someone who is unable to think is okay. You can understand why we can reason our way into abortion being okay because they're not real human beings yet.
Because they're not thinking yet. So their dignity, even if they have some, it's lowered because they're not thinking to such a degree that us who have the thinking capacity have a freedom higher than them.
Absolutely. So all of my dignity hinges on the fact that I can reason and make choices, and that's what makes me free, and that's what gives me dignity. Step aside from that into the Christian worldview, and our understanding of ourselves is like, I am created by God for relationship with him. He makes me because he wants me to exist, and my dignity comes from the very fact that I exist. So you can understand then why it's Christians who are largely championing life issues, for instance, because if this baby has come into existence, then it has dignity and that its life is worth fighting for.
The Christian reframing of Descartes would be,
I am, therefore I have dignity.
Yeah.
It's a huge contrast in actually thinking about how the world works, isn't it? I think, therefore I have dignity. I am, therefore I have dignity.
And I mean, I guess we talk with a lot of young people that are in this search of purpose, right? I'm sure we've talked about it before, but if you take away higher meanings, imposed meanings, relationship expectations, all that kind of stuff, like I could hear you saying we're made by God for a relationship with him. Now, if you were born into a Christian space where that is implicitly understood, you don't need to look for another purpose. But we have so many people feeling lost, wandering through the world looking for purpose because they've got to be the makers of meaning. It's the same thing we keep coming back to and back to.
And it fascinates me because even within this, I have the freedom to choose not to pursue that relationship with God. And it's a freedom. It's a very real freedom, and it's part of my dignity as a human person that I choose that. God doesn't want a bunch of robots that automatically love him and are in relationship with him because they have no choice. God wants free agents choosing that. So he's given us the very real opportunity to choose other. But if you think about the implications of choosing that other, if there really is a God and relationship with him is the best thing, then you get a whole lot of other doctrines that the deists want to throw out.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. And I think the thing that's really crucial here is that Orthodox Christianity, rather than affronting dignity, gives a firm foundation for our dignity, founded in our freedom, that actually beyond the gift of life, which all creatures have, there's a higher dignity in the human person on account of our free will.
Mm.
We're above animal instinct. We do have the mind, and we're able to not only have our mind, but as we're saying, the whole person, right? Like our human heart is capable of a relationship that the animals aren't, that the mind and the heart have to work together, right, in bringing about our freedom. And so I guess if we're looking at how do we take this out into the world, I think one of the best things that we can leave you with today, like a tool, would be to look at freedom. Look at how you see it understood in the world and how you understand it in your own heart. And particularly if you're a person of faith, to look at, well, how does being in relationship with God actually bring about a greater freedom? Because if you can articulate that well, if you can understand it clearly for yourself, then it means that you are empowered then to engage with this conversation of freedom that the world is so keen on talking about but doesn't necessarily understand.
And I also think if you can articulate it well, then you're probably more likely to be able to live it well because you're able to understand in yourself your own freedom. And that's more attractive even than any argument you'll come up with.
So thank you for listening, and let us know how you're going, what you're getting out of it, and please share it with anyone and everyone, because we just really believe that it's important stuff. And until next time, be well.
Amen.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.